Standing on the sidewalk outside St. Mary's Catholic Church, clutching my father's obituary from the morning paper, I never imagined my own mother would ban me from saying goodbye to the man who raised me. The funeral program trembled in my hands, as family members I'd grown up with walked past me like I was invisible, their eyes filled with judgment and disappointment. What happened next would shatter everything my family thought they knew about me, my father, and the 3 years of silence that had torn us apart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Sullivan, and until 3 years ago, I was Daddy's little girl. Growing up on Maple Street in Riverside, Ohio, our house was the kind of place where neighbors still borrowed cups of sugar and everyone knew everyone else's business. Dad, Robert Sullivan, ran Sullivan Associates Accounting from a small office downtown, the same practice his father had started in 1962. Every morning, he'd kiss my mother Patricia goodbye, ruffle my hair, and tell me I was destined for greatness. The Sullivan family had a plan. It was a simple plan, really, passed down through generations like an heirloom nobody questioned. The eldest child, my brother Michael, would take over Dad's accounting firm someday. The younger child, that was me, would become a lawyer, handling the legal side of family businesses throughout our small town. Together, we'd create a powerhouse that would serve Riverside for decades to come. For 18 years, I believed in that plan. I excelled in school, joined the debate team, volunteered at the courthouse during summers, and spent countless evenings listening to Dad explain the intricacies of small business finances. He'd spread tax documents across our kitchen table, pointing out how every number told a story about someone's dreams, struggles, and hopes. "Emma," he'd say, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Money isn't just numbers. It's people's lives on paper. Someday, you'll help protect those lives through law." I applied to Ohio State University's pre-law program and was accepted with a partial scholarship. Dad drove me to campus that August morning, helping me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs to my dorm room. Before he left, he handed me a card that simply read, "I'm proud of you. Make us proud." I kept that card tucked in my wallet throughout my undergraduate years, pulling it out whenever coursework became overwhelming or when I questioned whether I was on the right path. Law school was different. Columbus was bigger, more diverse, filled with people whose stories were nothing like mine. During my first year at Ohio State's Moritz College of Law, I took a required course on family law. Our professor, Dr. Martinez, assigned us to observe family court proceedings as part of our practical education. That's where I met 8-year-old Destiny. Destiny was small for her age, with braided hair that needed attention and shoes that were too big for her feet. She sat in the courthouse hallway with a social worker, waiting for a judge to decide whether she'd be reunified with her mother or placed in permanent foster care. Her case was complicated: addiction, domestic violence, multiple placements, and a mother who desperately wanted to get clean but kept relapsing. Watching that little girl navigate the legal system, I saw something that changed my perspective forever. The lawyers arguing her case were competent, professional, and thorough. They presented facts, cited precedents, and made compelling arguments. But none of them seemed to see Destiny as anything more than a case number. When the judge granted her mother one final chance at rehabilitation, I watched hope flicker in that child's eyes. When the same judge placed her back in foster care 6 months later, I saw that hope die. That night, I called Dad from my apartment near campus. We talked for 2 hours about justice, family, and what it means to truly help people. He listened patiently as I explained my growing doubts about corporate law, my questions about whether I wanted to spend my career protecting businesses or protecting children like Destiny. "Dad," I remember saying, "what if there's something else I'm supposed to do? Something that matters more than tax law and business contracts?" His response was gentle but firm. "Emma, sweetheart, you can help people through any profession. The law gives you power, stability, and the ability to create real change. Don't let one emotional case derail the future we've worked so hard to build." At the time, his words made sense. I was young, idealistic, and perhaps too easily swayed by what I'd witnessed. I promised him I'd finish law school and give legal practice a real chance. But Destiny's case haunted me. I started volunteering at the Franklin County Children's Services Office, helping with paperwork and administrative tasks. Soon, I was spending more time at the social services building than in law libraries. I met children who'd been through horrors I couldn't have imagined, social workers who were overworked and underpaid but fought tirelessly for kids who had no one else, and families desperately trying to rebuild after trauma had torn them apart. During my second year of law school, I changed my course load to include more family law, child advocacy, and social work electives. My grades in corporate law and tax classes began to slip, not because I couldn't understand the material, but because my heart simply wasn't in it anymore. When I called home, I found myself talking more about the children I was helping than about my legal studies. Mom noticed first. "Emma, you sound different when you talk about that volunteer work," she said during one of our Sunday phone calls. "It's wonderful that you want to help, but don't forget why you're in school. Your father has invested so much in your education, and we're all counting on you to succeed in law." The pressure built slowly, like water behind a dam. Every conversation with my family included subtle reminders about my future career, my responsibilities, and the legacy I was meant to continue. Meanwhile, every day I spent at the Children's Services Office showed me a world where my skills, empathy, and passion could make an immediate difference in young lives. The breaking point came during my third year of law school. I'd been assigned to help with a case involving 3 siblings who'd been separated in the foster system. The oldest, Marcus, was 15 and had been bouncing between group homes for 2 years. His younger sisters, ages 7 and 9, were in separate foster families across the city. They were all good kids from a situation that had spiraled out of control, and the system was failing them by keeping them apart. I spent weeks researching, making phone calls, and coordinating between agencies to find a placement that could keep the siblings together. When I finally found a foster family willing to take all 3 children, Marcus cried. Not the angry, frustrated tears I'd seen from him before, but tears of relief and gratitude. "Miss Emma," he said, "you gave me back my sisters." That moment crystallized everything for me. I wasn't meant to spend my life in courtrooms arguing about business disputes or tax regulations. I was meant to be in the trenches, working directly with families and children who needed someone to fight for them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was meant to be a social worker. The decision terrified me. I was months away from graduating law school, thousands of dollars in debt, and carrying the weight of my family's expectations. But I couldn't ignore what my heart was telling me. I started researching social work graduate programs, looking into ways I could transition my legal education into child advocacy work. When I finally worked up the courage to call Dad, I'd practiced my speech dozens of times. I planned to explain my passion for social work, my belief that I could make a greater impact helping families directly, and my hope that he'd understand and support my decision. The conversation didn't go as planned. "Emma, what are you saying?" Dad's voice was quiet, confused. "You're about to graduate from law school. You've worked so hard. We've all worked so hard. This is what we've planned for your entire life." I tried to explain about Marcus and his sisters, about Destiny, about the dozens of other children whose lives had intersected with mine over the past 3 years. I talked about purpose, passion, and the difference I could make as a social worker. Dad listened without interrupting, but I could feel his disappointment growing with each word. "Emma," he finally said, "you're throwing away everything we've built. The legal profession offers security, respect, and the ability to provide for your future family. Social work is noble, but it's not practical. You'll struggle financially, you'll burn out from the emotional toll, and you'll regret giving up the opportunities law school has provided. The conversation ended with both of us frustrated and hurt. Dad couldn't understand why I'd abandon a stable, prestigious career for what he saw as a less practical path. I couldn't understand why he wouldn't support my desire to help children, who desperately needed advocates. Over the following weeks, our phone calls became tense and strained. Mom tried to mediate, suggesting compromises like family law practice or corporate pro bono work with children's organizations. Michael, who'd always been the practical one, sided firmly with Dad. "Emma's lost her mind," I overheard him tell Mom during one of my visits home. "She's going to throw away a law degree to become a glorified social worker. Dad's right to be upset." The final confrontation happened during spring break of my 3rd year. I'd driven home to Riverside, hoping to have a calm, adult conversation with my parents about my future. Instead, the discussion erupted into the worst fight our family had ever experienced. "You're being selfish, Emma," Dad said, his voice raised in a way I'd rarely heard. "This isn't just about you. This family has invested in your education, your future, our future together. You have responsibilities that go beyond your own desires." "But Dad," I pleaded, "I'll be miserable as a lawyer. I'll spend every day wishing I was doing something that matters to me. Isn't my happiness worth something?" "Happiness is a luxury, Emma. Security and stability matter more than following every emotional whim. When you're struggling to pay bills, as a social worker, when you're dealing with bureaucracy and heartbreak every day, you'll remember this conversation and realize I was right." The fight escalated until harsh words were exchanged on both sides. I accused Dad of caring more about appearances and family reputation than my well-being. He accused me of being ungrateful and naive. Mom cried. Michael stormed out. And I made a decision that would haunt our family for 3 years. "Fine," I said, grabbing my car keys. "If you can't support my choices, if you can't accept that I know what's best for my own life, then maybe I don't belong in this family anymore." I drove back to Columbus that night and didn't return to Riverside for graduation. I finished law school, passed the bar exam out of spite more than ambition, and immediately enrolled in a Master of Social Work program at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. I found an apartment in Ohio City, started working for Cuyahoga, County's Division of Children and Family Services, and began building the life I'd always been meant to live. The silence that followed was deafening. For 3 years, my family and I existed in parallel worlds, connected only by geography and shared DNA. Holidays passed without phone calls. Birthdays went unacknowledged. I threw myself into my work, helping reunite families, advocating for children in crisis, and trying to convince myself that I didn't miss the sound of Dad's voice or Mom's Sunday dinners. What I didn't know was that Dad had been following my career from afar, reading every article written about my work, tracking the success of the programs I'd helped implement, and carrying a secret pride he couldn't bring himself to share. What I didn't know was that every Sunday at 2 o'clock, he'd sit by the phone hoping I might call, just as I sat in my Cleveland apartment hoping he might reach out to me. What I didn't know was that on the day he had his heart attack, my name was the last word he spoke before losing consciousness. 3 years of stubborn silence, 3 years of mutual hurt and misunderstanding, 3 years of a family torn apart by pride and miscommunication. And now, standing outside St. Mary's Catholic Church on a cold March morning, I was about to discover that sometimes the people we think understand us least are actually the ones who know us best. The funeral was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. Family members continued streaming past me, their faces a mixture of grief and disapproval. Aunt Carol, Dad's sister, paused briefly as if she might speak to me, then thought better of it and hurried inside. My nephew Tommy, Michael's 8-year-old son, waved at me from the church steps before Jessica quickly pulled him away. I stood there holding that crumpled obituary, reading Dad's accomplishments and wondering if my name would have appeared under "survived by" if our relationship hadn't been fractured. The March wind cut through my black dress, and I realized I was shivering not just from cold, but from the weight of 3 years' worth of regret and unfinished conversations. That's when I saw Mr. David Harrison, Dad's longtime lawyer and family friend, walking up the sidewalk toward the church entrance. He spotted me immediately, his expression shifting from professional composure to genuine surprise and concern. "Emma Sullivan," he said, approaching with measured steps. "I wasn't sure you'd be here." "I wasn't sure I'd be allowed," I replied, gesturing toward the church where my family had made it clear I wasn't welcome. Mr. Harrison studied my face for a long moment, then glanced toward the church entrance where Michael was still positioned like a sentry, ensuring I understood my exile. "Emma," he said quietly, "there are things about your father's final wishes that your family doesn't understand yet. Things that might surprise everyone, including you." Before I could ask what he meant, the church bells began to toll, signaling the start of the service. Mr. Harrison straightened his tie and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The service will be over in about an hour," he said. "I need you to come to my office immediately afterward. Your father left very specific instructions about his will, and you're mentioned prominently. In fact, he insisted that you be present for the reading, regardless of any family objections." My heart started racing. Dad had mentioned me in his will? After 3 years of silence, after the terrible things we'd said to each other, after I'd chosen a path he couldn't support? "Mr. Harrison," I whispered, "I don't understand. We haven't spoken in 3 years. Dad was so disappointed in me, so angry about my choices. Why would he—" "Emma," he interrupted gently, "your father was many things, but disappointed in you wasn't one of them. Not in the way you think. There's a story your family needs to hear, and Robert made sure that story would be told today, whether they wanted to hear it or not." As he walked toward the church, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk, I felt something shift inside my chest. For 3 years, I'd carried the weight of believing I'd failed my father, that I'd broken his heart by choosing social work over law, that I'd destroyed our relationship by following my passion instead of his plan. But Mr. Harrison's words suggested something different. They suggested that maybe, just maybe, the story I'd been telling myself about my father's disappointment wasn't the whole truth. They suggested that in a few hours, I was going to learn something that would change everything I thought I knew about the past 3 years. I looked up at St. Mary's stained glass windows, where colorful light filtered through images of saints and angels. Inside, Pastor Williams was probably beginning the service, talking about Dad's life, his accomplishments, his love for family and community. Inside, my mother was probably sitting in the front pew, supported by Michael and Jessica, grieving the loss of her husband of 32 years. Inside, friends and neighbors were remembering Robert Sullivan as a good man, a faithful husband, a devoted father. And outside, his youngest daughter was about to discover that sometimes love looks nothing like approval, and sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give a child is the freedom to become who they're meant to be, even when it breaks their heart to let them go. The next hour would feel like the longest of my life. But what I didn't know yet was that it would also be the hour that gave me back my father, my family, and the truth I'd been searching for since the day I walked out of our house on Maple Street 3 years ago. I watched through the church windows. As the service began, seeing familiar faces from my childhood gathered in wooden pews. Mrs. Henderson from next door, who used to bring us fresh cookies every Christmas. Coach Ryan, who taught me how to throw a softball in our backyard. The Kowalski family, whose daughter Amy had been my best friend until high school graduation. All of them were inside, sharing memories and mourning Dad together while I stood, on the cold sidewalk like an unwelcome stranger. 20 minutes into the service, I saw movement near the church entrance. Michael stepped outside, his face flushed with anger and something that looked like embarrassment. Behind him came Mom, her black dress perfectly pressed, her silver hair styled in the same neat bob she'd worn for decades. She moved with the composed dignity she'd always maintained during difficult moments, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the tight line of her mouth. "Emma, what are you doing here?" Mom's voice was quiet but sharp, designed not to carry to the people inside. "I thought I made it clear that today isn't appropriate for you to be here." "Mom, he was my father too." The words came out more desperate than I'd intended. "I know we haven't spoken. I know things ended badly between us, but I loved him. I need to say goodbye." Michael stepped forward, positioning himself between Mom and me like he was protecting her from a threat. At 32, my older brother had grown into a version of Dad that was somehow both familiar and foreign. He had the same strong jaw, the same serious eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, but where Dad had always carried himself with quiet confidence, Michael seemed perpetually wound tight, as if he was trying too hard to fill shoes that were still too big for him. "Love?" Michael's voice was bitter. "You loved him so much that you disappeared for 3 years? You loved him so much that you threw away everything he worked for? Everything he wanted for you? You loved him so much that you never called, never visited, never even sent a birthday card?" Each accusation hit like a physical blow. "Michael, you don't understand what happened between Dad and me. It was complicated." "Complicated?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What's complicated? About selfishness? What's complicated about breaking your father's heart so you could go play savior to other people's children while ignoring your own family?" "That's not what happened," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. Mom stepped closer, and I could see the exhaustion in her face, the way grief had carved new lines around her eyes. "Emma, your father spent months after you left trying to understand what he'd done wrong. He questioned every conversation, every decision, wondering how he'd failed as a parent. He blamed himself for your choice to cut us out of your life." The words were like acid in my stomach. "I didn't cut you out. I tried to call. I tried to explain." "Twice," Michael interrupted. "You called twice in 3 years. Once to tell us you were moving to Cleveland, and once to inform us you'd gotten some social work job. Both conversations lasted less than 5 minutes because you were too busy with your new life to have a real conversation with the people who raised you." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to explain that those weren't the only times I'd reached for the phone. They didn't know about the dozens of times I'd dialed our home number and hung up before anyone answered. They didn't know about the letters I'd written but never sent, the emails I'd composed and deleted, the birthday cards I'd bought but never mailed. They didn't know that every Sunday afternoon, I'd sit by my phone hoping one of them might call me first. But standing there on the church steps, surrounded by the murmur of prayers and hymns drifting through the windows, I realized that my intentions didn't matter. My family had experienced my silence as abandonment, and their pain was real regardless of my reasons. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry about how things happened. I never meant to hurt Dad, or any of you. I was trying to follow my heart, to do what I thought was right for me, but I handled it all wrong." Mom's expression softened slightly, but Michael's remained cold. "Sorry doesn't bring him back, Emma. Sorry doesn't undo 3 years of him wondering why his daughter hated him so much, that she couldn't even bear to be in the same room with him. I never hated him." The words exploded out of me, louder than I'd intended. Several people walking toward the church entrance turned to stare. I loved Dad more than anything in this world. That's why it hurt so much when he couldn't accept my choices. That's why I stayed away, because every conversation became a fight about my career, my future, my decisions. I thought if I gave him space, he might eventually understand. Understand what? Michael demanded. That his daughter was too good for the family business? That law school was beneath her? That helping strangers was more important than the people who sacrificed everything for her education? That I needed to become who I was meant to be, not who everyone else wanted me to be. My voice cracked. Dad had a vision for my life that didn't match who I actually am. I tried to fit into that vision for years, Michael. I went to law school, I took the classes, I did everything he asked. But I was miserable. I was dying inside, pretending to want something I didn't want. Mom spoke quietly, but her words cut deep. So you thought it was better to let him die believing you'd rejected everything he'd worked for? You thought it was kinder to let him spend his last years thinking he'd somehow failed as a father? The guilt that I'd been carrying for 3 years suddenly felt unbearable. Mom, I didn't know he was sick. I didn't know he was going to have a heart attack. I thought we had time to work things out, to find a way back to each other. There's always time, she said, until there isn't. The truth of that statement settled over me like a heavy blanket. I'd spent 3 years waiting for the right moment to reach out, for my anger to fade, for Dad to make the first move, for some magical opportunity when we could have an honest conversation without yelling. I'd been waiting for time that no longer existed. Mrs. Sullivan, Emma, I'm sorry to interrupt. Mr. Harrison had approached so quietly that none of us had noticed him. The service is nearly over, and I need to speak with all of you about Robert's will. There are some unusual circumstances that require immediate attention. Michael frowned. Unusual circumstances? Dad's will should be straightforward. The business goes to me. The house and assets are divided between Mom and me, and there are some small charitable donations. What could be unusual about that? Mr. Harrison glanced at me, then back at Michael and Mom. Your father made significant changes to his will just 2 weeks before his death. Changes that affect the entire family, including Emma. He left very specific instructions about how his estate should be handled, and he insisted that all of his children be present for the reading. Emma isn't... Michael started to object, but Mr. Harrison held up a hand. Robert was very clear. Emma is to be included in all estate proceedings. In fact, her presence is mandatory according to his written instructions. The will cannot be read without her. I saw Mom and Michael exchange a confused look. This wasn't what any of us had expected. Dad had been angry with me, disappointed in my choices, hurt by my apparent rejection of the family. Why would he insist on including me in his final wishes? Mr. Harrison, Mom said carefully, I think there might be some misunderstanding. Emma and Robert hadn't spoken in 3 years. She made it clear that she didn't want to be part of this family anymore. Why would he... Mrs. Sullivan, the lawyer interrupted gently, there are aspects of Robert's final months that might surprise you. He left detailed instructions about what information should be shared and when. I'm bound by attorney-client privilege to honor his wishes exactly as he outlined them. Just then, the church doors opened and people began filing out. The service was over. I watched as neighbors and friends approached Mom and Michael, offering condolences and sharing brief memories of Dad. Several people glanced at me curiously, probably wondering why I was standing apart from my family, why I looked like I'd been crying, why the tension between us was so obvious. Aunt Carol emerged from the church and walked directly toward us. Dad's older sister had always been the peacemaker in the family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found compromises during holidays and family gatherings. She was 73 now, her gray hair perfectly curled, wearing the same black dress she'd worn to every funeral for the past decade. Emma, sweetheart, she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like lavender and old-fashioned powder. I'm so glad you came. Your father would have been happy to see you here. Aunt Carol, Michael said through gritted teeth, Emma wasn't invited. She chose not to be part of this family, and her presence here is inappropriate. Aunt Carol released me but kept one arm around my shoulders. Michael Robert Sullivan, that is enough. This girl lost her father just like you did, and grief makes people say and do things they don't mean. Your dad wouldn't want his funeral to be remembered for family fighting on the church steps. But she... Michael started to argue. She what? Made different choices than you would have made? Followed her heart instead of your father's plans? Good Lord, child. Do you think you're the first family in history to have disagreements about careers and life paths? Mom looked uncomfortable with the public nature of our conflict. More people were staring now, and I could see her calculating how this scene would be discussed around Riverside for weeks to come. The Sullivan family drama was becoming entertainment for our neighbors, and that was something Mom would never tolerate. We should continue this conversation somewhere more private, she said firmly. Mr. Harrison, what time did you want to meet about the will? My office is available now, if that works for everyone. Given the circumstances, I think it would be best to handle this matter quickly and discreetly. I wanted to ask what circumstances he was referring to, but the growing crowd of curious onlookers made it clear that the church steps weren't the place for family revelations. We agreed to meet at Harrison Associates in 30 minutes, giving everyone time to collect themselves and drive across town. As people dispersed, heading to their cars or gathering in small groups to continue conversations about Dad's life and legacy, I found myself walking alone toward my Honda Civic parked 2 blocks away. I'd deliberately parked far from the church, anticipating exactly the scene that had just played out. I'd known my presence would be controversial, but I'd underestimated how much pain my family was carrying, how deeply my 3-year absence had wounded all of them. The drive to Mr. Harrison's office gave me time to think about what I'd just learned. According to Michael and Mom, Dad had spent months after our fight questioning his own parenting, blaming himself for my decision to pursue social work instead of law. They believed I'd called only twice in 3 years, that I'd essentially abandoned the family without explanation or ongoing contact. But that wasn't the whole truth. What they didn't know was that I'd maintained a secret connection with Dad, one that neither of us had told anyone about. What they didn't know was that every Sunday at 2 o'clock, my phone would ring and Dad's voice would fill my Cleveland apartment. Those weekly conversations had started about 6 months after our big fight. I was having a particularly difficult day at work, dealing with a case involving twin toddlers who'd been severely neglected when my phone rang. Dad's name appeared on the screen, and before I could think about whether answering was a good idea, I'd accepted the call. Emma? His voice was tentative, unsure. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Dad? I was so surprised I nearly dropped the phone. How did you get my number? Aunt Carol, he admitted. She said you'd given it to her in case of emergencies. I've been thinking about calling for weeks, but I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from me. That first conversation was awkward and brief. We talked about safe topics like the weather, my apartment, his work at the accounting firm. Neither of us mentioned our fight or the harsh words we'd exchanged, but something about hearing his voice, again about knowing he'd reached out despite our conflict, made me feel less alone in the world. The weekly calls became a routine that neither of us acknowledged to the rest of the family. Every Sunday at 2 o'clock, Dad would call from his home office while Mom was at her book club meeting. We'd talk for anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, sharing details about our lives that we couldn't discuss with anyone else. Dad told me about the challenges of running the accounting firm without a succession plan, about his worries that Michael wasn't quite ready for the responsibility, about clients who'd become friends over decades of doing their taxes and helping them navigate financial decisions. I told him about the children I was working with, the families I was helping to reunite, the foster parents who opened their hearts and homes to kids who needed stability and love. Gradually, our conversations deepened. Dad began asking thoughtful questions about social work, about the systems I navigated daily. about the victories and heartbreaks that came with my job. I started sharing specific cases with him, explaining how family dynamics affected children, how poverty and addiction and mental illness created cycles that were difficult to break. "You know, Emma," he said during one of our conversations about 6 months before he died, "I've been reading articles about the work you're doing in Cleveland. There was a piece in the Plain Dealer about that program you helped develop for kinship care placements. The journalist made it sound like you've helped dozens of families stay together." I was surprised he'd been following my career, that he'd sought out information about my work. "Dad, I didn't know you were keeping track of what I was doing." "Of course I'm keeping track. You're my daughter. Just because we disagree about career paths doesn't mean I don't care about your success and happiness." Those words meant more to me than any praise I'd ever received from supervisors or colleagues. Dad cared about my success, even in a field he didn't understand or value. He was proud of my work, even though it wasn't the work he'd envisioned for me. But we never talked about telling the rest of the family about our renewed relationship. We never discussed why our conversations needed to remain secret, why neither of us felt comfortable revealing to Mom and Michael that we'd found a way back to each other. The secrecy felt necessary somehow, like acknowledging our weekly calls would force us to confront all the things we still couldn't discuss. Now, pulling into the parking lot of Harrison and Associates, I realized that our secret had become a burden for both of us. Dad had been carrying the weight of appearing estranged from me while actually maintaining a close relationship. I'd been carrying the guilt of believing my family thought I didn't care, when at least one member of that family knew exactly how much I loved him. Mr. Harrison's office was in a converted Victorian house on Main Street, the kind of building that gave Riverside its small-town charm. I'd been there several times as a child when Dad needed to sign legal documents or update his will. The waiting room still had the same floral wallpaper and overstuffed furniture that I remembered from 20 years ago. Mom and Michael arrived just as I was getting out of my car. We walked into the building together without speaking, the tension between us still thick and unresolved. Jessica had stayed home with Tommy, which was probably wise given the volatile nature of our family dynamics that day. Mr. Harrison greeted us in his private office, a room lined with law books and family photos that spoke to decades of serving Riverside's legal needs. He was in his mid-60s, with silver hair and the kind of steady demeanor that made people trust him with their most important documents and decisions. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to chairs arranged around his desk. "Before we begin, with the formal reading of the will, I need to share some context that Robert specifically requested I provide." He opened a thick folder and removed several documents, including what appeared to be a letter written in Dad's familiar handwriting. Robert came to see me on March 1st, just 2 weeks before his death. He said he needed to make substantial changes to his will, and he wanted to ensure that certain information would be shared with his family after his passing. Mom leaned forward. "What kind of changes? And what information?" Mr. Harrison looked directly at me. "Emma, your father, asked me to tell your family about the weekly phone calls you two had been sharing for the past 2.5 years. He said it was important for Michael and Patricia to understand that your relationship with him was very different from what they believed." The room went completely silent. I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment and something that might have been relief. Mom's mouth opened slightly, and Michael stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Phone calls?" Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. "What phone calls?" "Every Sunday at 2 o'clock, Mr. Harrison continued. Robert would call Emma from his home office. They maintained regular contact throughout the period when you believed they were estranged. According to Robert, these conversations were some of the highlights of his week. Michael's face was changing color, shifting from confusion to anger to something that looked like hurt. "That's impossible. Dad never mentioned talking to Emma. He said she'd abandoned the family, that she didn't care about us anymore." "Actually," Mr. Harrison said gently, Robert said that he allowed you and your mother to believe Emma had cut off contact because he was ashamed of the fight they'd had. Ashamed that his reaction to her career choice had been so harsh that she felt unable to maintain an open relationship with the family. He thought it was easier to let you blame Emma than to admit that his own pride had created the situation. The implications of this revelation were staggering. For 3 years, Mom and Michael had resented me for abandoning Dad, while Dad had been secretly maintaining our relationship and allowing them to blame me for his own choices. For 3 years, I'd been carrying guilt about hurting my family, while Dad had been protecting me from their anger by absorbing it himself. "I don't understand," Mom said, her voice shaking. "If they were talking every week, why didn't Robert tell me? Why did he let me spend 3 years thinking Emma didn't care about him?" Mr. Harrison consulted his notes. According to Robert, he initially planned to tell you and Michael about the phone calls, but as time passed, it became more difficult to admit that he'd been keeping a secret. He also mentioned that Emma's work was flourishing, and he didn't want family pressure to interfere with her success. He was proud of what she was accomplishing, and he wanted to protect her ability to focus on her career. I felt tears starting to form. Dad had been protecting me, even at the cost of his relationships with Mom and Michael. He'd allowed them to be angry with me rather than reveal that we'd found our way back to each other, because he thought it was better for me to have their disapproval than to have family obligations interfering with my work. "This is insane," Michael said, standing up abruptly. "You're telling me that for 3 years Dad lied to us about Emma? That he pretended to be hurt and confused when he was actually having regular conversations with her? Why would he do that?" "Because," Mr. Harrison said, opening the letter in Dad's handwriting, "he wanted to explain that himself. Robert wrote this letter specifically for today, for this moment when his secret would be revealed. He asked that I read it to all of you together." He cleared his throat and began to read in Dad's voice, words that would change everything we thought we knew about love, sacrifice, and the lengths a parent will go to protect their children from the consequences of their own mistakes. Mr. Harrison adjusted his reading glasses and held Dad's letter with the reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. The paper looked worn, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times, and I could see Dad's careful handwriting filling both sides of the cream-colored stationery he'd always used for important correspondence. "This letter is dated March 2nd, the day after Robert revised his will," Mr. Harrison began. He titled it, "To My Family, The Truth About Emma and Me." The lawyer's voice took on a gentle cadence as he began reading Dad's words. "To Patricia, Michael, and Emma, if you're hearing. This letter, then I'm gone, and it's time for secrets to end. I've asked David to gather you all together because there are things I should have said while I was alive, truths I should have shared, and apologies I should have made. First, to Patricia and Michael, I need you to know that Emma never abandoned our family. She never stopped loving me, and she never stopped caring about all of you. For the past 2.5 years, Emma and I have spoken every Sunday afternoon. These conversations became the highlight of my week, and through them, I got to know my daughter as the remarkable woman she's become, not just the child I'd planned her future for. I let you both believe that Emma had cut off contact because I was ashamed. I was ashamed of how I'd reacted when she told me about her decision to become a social worker. I was ashamed of the things I'd said during our final argument, words spoken from pride and fear rather than love and understanding. When she moved to Cleveland and our relationship became strained, I convinced myself it was easier to let you blame her than to admit I'd driven her away with my stubbornness. The truth is that Emma tried repeatedly to maintain a relationship with our entire family. She called the house dozens of times in those first months after our fight, but I was too proud to talk through our disagreement, and eventually, she stopped calling the main number. When she gave Aunt Carol her phone number for emergencies, I saw it as an opportunity to reach out privately, to repair our relationship without having to admit to you both how badly I'd handled everything. Our Sunday conversations began as awkward check-ins, but they evolved into something beautiful. Emma would tell me about the children she was helping, the families she was reuniting, the difference her work was making in Cleveland's foster care system. I started researching social work, reading articles about child welfare, learning about the complexities of the field I'd dismissed so carelessly. Patricia, Michael, I need you to understand something that might be difficult to hear. Emma was right to choose social work over law. Not because law isn't a noble profession, but because social work is her calling in a way that law never could have been. Watching her find her purpose, hearing the passion in her voice when she talked about her work, made me realize that I'd been trying to force her into a life that would have made her miserable. I never told you about our conversations because I was protecting both Emma and myself. I was protecting Emma from the pressure to return home before she was ready, from having to navigate the complex dynamics of our family's expectations while she was building her career. And I was protecting myself from having to admit that I'd been wrong about her choices, wrong about what success should look like for my daughter, wrong about what kind of father I wanted to be. Michael, I know this revelation might hurt you. You've spent 3 years believing that Emma had rejected our family's values and legacy. But I need you to understand that Emma's choice to become a social worker wasn't a rejection of our family. It was an expression of the values we actually taught her. We raised her to care about people, to work hard, to make a difference in the world. She's doing exactly that, just not in the way we originally envisioned. Emma has helped more than 200 children find stable homes during her time in Cleveland. She's developed programs that have revolutionized how kinship care placements are handled in Cuyahoga County. She's testified before the Ohio State Legislature about foster care reform. The work she's doing matters in ways that extend far beyond what any individual legal practice could accomplish. I've been following her career through news articles, professional publications, and her own accounts of her daily work. I've read every story written about the programs she's developed, every interview she's given about child welfare policy. I couldn't have been more proud if she'd become the most successful lawyer in Ohio. Patricia, my love, I know this news will be difficult for you to process. You've spent 3 years mourning what you thought was the loss of our daughter's love and respect. But Emma never stopped loving us. She called me every week for 2.5 years, asking about your health, your activities, your happiness. She wanted desperately to repair her relationship with you and Michael, but she was afraid that admitting to our ongoing contact would make the family dynamics even more complicated. Emma told me about every holiday she spent alone, every birthday, when she wondered if she should send cards, every Christmas when she drove past our house hoping to catch a glimpse of family celebrations. She's been grieving the loss of open family relationships just as much as you've been grieving the loss of her presence. The fault for this 3-year separation lies entirely with me. I created the conditions that made Emma feel unwelcome in our home. I reacted to her career choice with disappointment and anger instead of curiosity and support. I prioritized my own vision for her future over her autonomy and happiness. When she tried to maintain family relationships after our fight, I made it clear that I wasn't ready to accept her decisions, so she gave me the space I seemed to need. Our secret phone calls were a gift, but they were also a failure on my part. I should have been brave enough to tell you both that Emma and I had found our way back to each other. I should have admitted that she was thriving in her chosen field, that she was happy and successful and making a real difference in the world. I should have used my influence as husband and father to help heal our family instead of allowing the wounds to fester. Emma, my darling daughter, if you're hearing this, I need you to know that you have nothing to apologize for. You followed your heart, you pursued your calling, and you've become exactly the person you were meant to be. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that your path was the right one for you. I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to choose between your family and your purpose. Most of all, I'm sorry that my pride kept our family fractured when love should have brought us together. I want you to know that our Sunday conversations were the best part of my week. Hearing about your work, your clients, your victories, and challenges gave me a window into a world I'd never understood. You opened my eyes to the complexity of child welfare, the courage required for social work, the difference one dedicated person can make in the lives of vulnerable children and families. You didn't just become a social worker, Emma. You became an advocate, a healer, a voice for children who had no one else to speak for them. The pride I feel in your accomplishments goes beyond anything I could express in our weekly conversations. You've exceeded every dream I ever had for your future, just not in the way I originally imagined. To all three of you, I'm asking for forgiveness for the secrets I've kept, the pain I've caused, and the time we've lost to misunderstanding and pride. Family relationships are precious and fragile, and I've learned too late that love requires courage, honesty, and the willingness to admit when we're wrong. Patricia and Michael, I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive Emma for the imagined abandonment that was actually my creation. She's been longing to come home, to be part of our family again, but she didn't know how to bridge the gap that my stubbornness had created. Emma, I hope you can forgive your mother and brother for the anger they've directed toward you. They were protecting me, defending what they thought was my heartbreak, without knowing that my heart was actually full of pride and love for the woman you've become. This letter is my final act as head of this family, and I'm using it to set the record straight. Emma Sullivan is not the daughter who abandoned her family. She's the daughter who chose courage over comfort, purpose over prestige, and service over security. She's the daughter who called me every Sunday for 2.5 years, sharing her life and listening to mine, maintaining our connection even when it had to remain secret. She's the daughter I'm most proud of, not despite her choice to become a social worker, but because of it. Mr. Harrison paused, removing his glasses to clean them before continuing. The office was so quiet I could hear the antique clock on his desk ticking, marking seconds that felt like hours. Mom was crying silently, her hands pressed to her mouth. Michael sat frozen, staring at the lawyer as if he couldn't quite process what he was hearing. "There's more," Mr. Harrison said gently, replacing his glasses and returning to the letter. "Now, regarding my will and the distribution of my estate, I've made decisions that reflect my true feelings about my children's paths and accomplishments, rather than the disappointment I pretended to feel. Michael, you will inherit the accounting firm as we've always planned. You're ready for the responsibility, and I know you'll serve our community with the same dedication I've tried to provide. For 40 years. You'll also inherit the family home, as it should remain in the Sullivan name and provide a stable foundation for your growing family. However, I've also established a substantial trust fund to support Emma's social work programs. This trust contains 40% of my life insurance policy, the proceeds from my investment portfolio, and the rental income from the 3 properties I've owned downtown. The annual income from this trust should be enough to expand Emma's work significantly, perhaps even to establish a nonprofit organization focused on kinship care and family reunification. Emma, I've been contributing anonymously to your current programs for the past 18 months. The extra funding you thought came from federal grants actually came from me. I wanted to support your work without revealing our ongoing relationship, so I channeled the money through intermediary organizations. You've used these funds wisely and effectively, proving that you understand both the compassionate and practical sides of helping families in crisis. I'm also leaving Emma my father's house on Elm Street, the one that's been sitting empty since Grandpa died. It needs work, but it could be converted into offices for a family services organization, or it could simply be Emma's home if she ever decides to return to Riverside. The choice is hers. Patricia, my beloved wife, you'll receive my pension, the remainder of the life insurance, and full ownership of your car and personal belongings. You'll also have lifetime residence rights in the family home, so you'll never have to worry about housing or security. Michael understands that the house belongs to both of you for as long as you need it. I've also set aside funds for Tommy's college education, because education has always been important to our family, and I want my grandson to have every opportunity to pursue whatever path brings him joy and fulfillment. But beyond the financial arrangements, I have one final request. I want my family to be whole again. I want Sunday dinners where all of my children are present. I want holidays that include everyone. I want Emma's future children to know their grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. I want the love that has always existed in this family to be openly expressed and freely given. The 3 years of separation have been my fault, but healing our relationships will require effort from all of you. Patricia, Michael, please don't. Make Emma earn her way back into your hearts. She never left them. I just convinced you that she had. Welcome her home with the love she's always deserved. Emma, please don't let pride or fear keep you from accepting the family relationships that are being offered. You've built a beautiful life in Cleveland, but life is even more beautiful when it's shared with people who love you unconditionally. I'm not naive enough to think that reading this letter will magically solve 3 years of hurt and misunderstanding. Healing takes time, patience, and consistent effort from everyone involved. But I am hopeful that truth, even truth revealed, too late, can be the foundation for a stronger, more honest family than we had before. My final words are words of love and gratitude. Patricia, thank you for 32 years of marriage, for raising our children with wisdom and grace, for being the steady foundation that allowed me to build a successful business and meaningful life. You are the love of my life, and I'm sorry that my final years were clouded by family conflict that I should have resolved. Michael, thank you for being the son who carried on family traditions, who valued stability and security, who made choices that honored our legacy. You've been everything a father could want in an eldest child, and I'm confident that you'll lead our family with strength and wisdom after I'm gone. Emma, thank you for being the daughter who taught me that love sometimes means letting go, that success comes in many forms, and that the greatest achievements are often measured in lives touched rather than dollars earned. You've been everything a father could want in a child, and I'm grateful that our Sunday conversations allowed me to witness the remarkable woman you've become. To all of you, thank you for giving me a life worth living, a purpose worth pursuing, and love worth treasuring. Take care of each other, forgive each other's mistakes, and remember that family is the most important legacy we leave behind. I love you all more than words can express, and I'm sorry it took my death to bring us back together. But if this letter accomplishes what I hope it will, then perhaps something beautiful can grow from the pain of losing me. Forever your husband and father, Robert Sullivan. Mr. Harrison folded the letter carefully and placed it on his desk. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Mom's quiet sobbing and the distant traffic on Main Street. I felt as though the foundation of everything I'd believed about the past 3 years had shifted beneath me. Dad had loved me. Dad had been proud of me. Dad had been secretly supporting my work, following my career, and bragging about my accomplishments to his lawyer. The guilt I'd carried for 3 years, the belief that I'd broken his heart by pursuing social work, the fear that I'd damaged our relationship beyond repair, all of it had been based on incomplete information. But even more shocking was the revelation that he'd been protecting me from family pressure while allowing Mom and Michael to believe I'd abandoned him. He'd sacrificed his relationships with them to preserve my autonomy and professional success. The secret phone calls that had meant so much to me had cost him the open support of his wife and son. Michael was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years. 3 years I spent hating Emma for something she didn't do. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with tears. Emma, I'm so sorry. I said horrible things to you today, accused you of breaking Dad's heart when he was actually... He couldn't finish the sentence. When he was protecting me from exactly the kind of pressure you put on me this morning, I said quietly. Michael, Dad knew that if you and Mom found out we were talking, you'd push me to come home, to take a job in Riverside, to give up the work I was doing in Cleveland. He thought it was better for me to have your disapproval than to have my career disrupted by family obligations. Mom looked up from her tear-soaked tissue. But I would have supported your work if I'd known how much it meant to you, how successful you were becoming. I would have been proud of you. Would you have? I asked gently. Or would you have worried about me living alone in Cleveland, working with dangerous families, dealing with heartbreaking cases every day? Would you have encouraged me to find something safer, closer to home, more traditional? The question hung in the air because we all knew the answer. Mom would have worried, would have suggested alternatives, would have gradually worn down my resolve with loving concern and practical suggestions. Dad had protected my independence by absorbing the family's disappointment himself. He sacrificed his relationships with both of you so that I could succeed without interference, I continued. That's not something a disappointed father does. That's something a father does when he loves his daughter more than his own comfort. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat gently. There are still some practical matters to discuss regarding the will, but I want to give you all time to process what you've just heard. The estate arrangements are quite generous to everyone involved, and Robert was very specific about his hopes for how this information would bring the family back together. The money doesn't matter, Michael said, shaking his head. I mean, it matters, but not compared to what we've lost. 3 years, Emma. 3 years when we could have been supporting each other, celebrating your success, being a family. We can't get those 3 years back, I said, but we can decide what happens next. Dad's letter wasn't just about revealing the truth. It was about giving us a chance to start over, to build something better than what we had before. Mom reached for my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. Emma, sweetheart, can you ever forgive us for today? For the things we said at the church? For making you feel unwelcome at your own father's funeral? I squeezed her hand, feeling the familiar warmth of her touch, the comfort of being connected to my mother again after 3 years of distance. Mom, we all made mistakes. We all let pride and fear keep us from having honest conversations. But Dad's letter gives us a roadmap for moving forward. He wants us to be a family again, and that's what I want too. Michael stood up abruptly and walked to the window overlooking Main Street. His shoulders were shaking, and I realized he was crying in earnest now, the kind of deep, wrenching sobs that come from grief mixed with regret. I was supposed to protect this family, he said without turning around. I was the older brother, the responsible one. I was supposed to keep us together, and instead I drove you away further by being cruel to you today. Michael, I said, standing and walking to join him at the window. You were protecting Mom and defending Dad's memory based on the information you had. You couldn't have known about the phone calls, about his true feelings. We were all working with incomplete information. He turned to face me, his face streaked with tears. But I should have known you better. I should have known that the Emma I grew up with, the sister who used to bring me soup when I was sick, who helped me with my algebra homework, who cried when our dog died, that Emma wouldn't just abandon her family without a good reason. And I should have been braver about reaching out to you and Mom directly, I replied. I should have insisted on family conversations instead of accepting the secret relationship with Dad. I let fear and hurt feelings keep me from fighting for all of our relationships. The weight of 3 years of misunderstanding was finally lifting, replaced by the possibility of genuine reconciliation. We had work to do, conversations to have, trust to rebuild. But for the first time since I'd left Riverside, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. Mr. Harrison gathered the will documents and other papers spread across his desk. I'll prepare the formal estate paperwork over the next few days. Emma, You'll need to decide whether you want to accept the property on Elm Street and the terms of the trust fund. There are some tax implications we should discuss, and you'll need to establish legal structures for managing the charitable funds. I'll need some time to think about everything, I said. The money, the property, moving back to Riverside. It's all overwhelming right now. Of course, he said. Take all the time you need. Robert's instructions were clear that these gifts come with no strings attached. If you decide you're happier in Cleveland, the trust fund can support your work there just as easily as it could. Fund new programs in Riverside. As we prepared to leave his office, I realized that Dad had given us something more valuable than money or property. He'd given us the truth, and with it, the chance to rebuild our family on a foundation of honesty and acceptance rather than expectations and assumptions. The man we'd just buried had orchestrated his own final act of love, using his death to repair the relationships his pride had damaged during his life. It was a complicated legacy, but it was also a generous one. He'd found a way to heal our family even after he was gone, and that might have been his greatest accomplishment of all. Walking out of the lawyer's office into the late afternoon sunlight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. The possibility of going home. 6 months after Dad's funeral, I stood in the doorway of Grandpa Sullivan's old house on Elm Street, keys heavy in my palm and dust motes dancing in the October, sunlight streaming through grimy windows. The Victorian-era home had been empty for 8 years, slowly accumulating the particular silence that settles into places where life used to happen. But today, for the first time since inheriting it, the house felt full of possibility rather than ghosts. The past half year had been a whirlwind of decisions, conversations, and careful steps toward rebuilding relationships that had been fractured for too long. Leaving Cleveland hadn't been easy. I'd spent 4 years building programs, training staff, and developing relationships with families throughout Cuyahoga County. The children I'd worked with, the foster families I'd supported, the kinship caregivers I'd trained, they all felt like family I was abandoning. But the trust fund Dad had established changed everything. With annual income that exceeded my Cleveland salary by 3 times, I could hire additional staff, expand services, and create the kind of comprehensive family support system I'd only dreamed about in my county job. More importantly, I could do it in Riverside, close to the family I'd finally found my way back to. The process of returning home had been gradual and sometimes painful. After Mr. Harrison's revelations about Dad's true feelings, Mom, Michael, and I had spent hours in his office over several weeks, working through lawyers and financial advisors to understand the full scope of Dad's final gifts. The trust fund was more substantial than any of us had imagined, structured to provide sustainable funding for social work programs while also generating enough income to support my personal expenses. But the money, significant as it was, mattered, less than the conversations it facilitated. For the first time in years, Mom, Michael, and I sat around tables together, sometimes in sterile conference rooms, sometimes in coffee shops, eventually in Mom's kitchen, talking honestly about expectations, disappointments, and dreams for our family's future. The first real breakthrough came 3 weeks after the funeral, when Mom called me at my Cleveland apartment on a Sunday afternoon. It was 2 o'clock, the exact time Dad used to call me, and I knew the timing wasn't coincidental. "Emma," she said when I answered, her voice tentative but warm. "I was hoping we could talk. Not about wills or money or legal arrangements. Just talk, the way we used to when you were younger." That conversation lasted 3 hours. Mom told me about the loneliness she'd felt during my absence, how she'd driven past my old apartment, building during visits to Cleveland, hoping she might accidentally see me. She talked about the guilt she'd carried for not understanding my career choice, for letting Dad handle our family's reaction to my decisions without questioning whether his approach was right. I told her about the Sunday afternoons I'd spent missing family dinners, About the holidays when I'd parked outside our house on Maple Street just to see the warm light in the windows. About the dozens of times I'd written letters or emails that I'd never sent because I didn't know how to bridge the gap that had opened between us. "Sweetheart," Mom said near the end of that conversation, "I want you to know that your father wasn't the only one who was proud of your work. I've been reading about the programs you developed in Cleveland, the awards you've won, the families you've helped. I didn't understand what social work really meant when you first told us about it, but I understand now that you're saving children's lives every day." Those words meant everything to me. For 4 years, I'd wondered whether my family could ever accept my career choice, whether they'd ever see my work as valuable rather than as a rejection of their values. Hearing Mom express genuine pride in my accomplishments felt like coming home emotionally before I'd even considered coming home physically. Michael's journey toward acceptance took longer and followed a different path. 2 months after the funeral, he drove to Cleveland on a Saturday morning, showing up at my apartment unannounced with coffee and an expression I couldn't quite read. "I need to see where you work," he said without preamble. "I need to understand what Dad saw in your career that I couldn't see." I took him to the Cuyahoga County building where I'd spent 4 years navigating the complex systems designed to protect vulnerable children. I showed him case files, explained court processes, introduced him to colleagues who'd become friends. We visited 2 foster families who'd become part of my extended professional network, families who welcomed us into their homes and shared stories about children they'd helped heal from trauma. The turning point came when we met Marcus, the 15-year-old boy whose case had first made me realize I wanted to be a social worker. He was 17 now, thriving in a kinship placement with his aunt, and preparing for his senior year of high school. When I introduced Michael as my brother, Marcus immediately started talking about how I'd helped reunite him with his sisters. "Miss Emma saved my family," Marcus told Michael with the serious intensity that teenagers bring to important truths. "When the system wanted to keep us separated, she fought for us. She made phone calls, filled out paperwork, drove all over the city finding people who would take all 3 of us together. I wouldn't have my sisters if it wasn't for her." After we left Marcus's aunt's house, Michael was quiet for a long time. Finally, as we sat in his car outside my apartment building, he spoke. "I owe you an apology that goes way beyond what I said at Dad's funeral," he began. "I've spent years thinking you'd thrown away a good career to play savior to other people's children. But that kid, Marcus, the way he talked about you, the way his whole family lit up when they saw you. I understand now that you didn't throw anything away. You found something that most people never find." "What's that?" I asked. "Your purpose, your calling, the thing you were put on earth to do." He turned to look at me, his eyes serious behind his glasses. "I run Dad's accounting firm and I'm good at it. I help people with their taxes, their business finances, their retirement planning. It's important work, and I'm proud of it. But I've never had a 17-year-old kid tell someone that I saved his family." That conversation marked the beginning of a genuine friendship between Michael and me, something we'd never quite managed to achieve as children. He started calling me weekly, not because he felt obligated to maintain family relationships, but because he was genuinely interested in my work and my life. When I told him about my decision to return to Riverside, he was the first person to offer practical help with the logistics of moving and setting up a new practice. The decision to leave Cleveland was agonizing. My supervisor offered me a promotion to district coordinator, a position that would have involved overseeing social workers across multiple counties. My colleagues threw a going-away party that lasted until 2 a.m, sharing stories about cases we'd worked together and promising to stay in touch as my career progressed. The foster families I'd worked with gave me cards, photos, and small gifts that I packed carefully in boxes marked treasures. But the hardest goodbye was with Marcus and his sisters. They were thriving, no longer needing regular social work services, but they'd become part of my heart in a way that transcended professional relationships. Marcus was planning to study social work in college, inspired by what he'd seen of my Career. His middle sister, Keisha, was excelling in school and talking about becoming a teacher. The youngest, Tamara, had been placed in an accelerated program for gifted students. "Miss Emma," Marcus said during our final meeting, "you taught me that families come in all kinds of shapes. We're always going to be your family, even if you live in Ohio and we live in Cleveland." "That's right," I told him, fighting back tears. "Distance doesn't change love. I'll always be proud of you three, and I'll always be here if you need me." The logistics of returning to Riverside were complicated, but manageable. I hired a moving company, arranged for temporary housing in a furnished apartment downtown, and began the legal processes necessary to establish a nonprofit organization. Dad's trust fund required that I create a formal charitable entity to receive and distribute the money. So I spent weeks with lawyers and accountants setting up the Sullivan Family Foundation for Children's Services. The name felt right. It honored Dad's memory while clearly stating the organization's mission. The foundation would fund direct services, policy advocacy, training programs, and research related to child welfare and family preservation. With the trust fund's annual income, I could hire a staff of 6 people, rent office space, and provide services that would complement rather than compete with existing county programs. But before I could focus on building the foundation, I had to address the elephant in the room: Grandpa's house on Elm Street. The Victorian home was structurally sound, but needed extensive renovations to function as either a residence or office space. I spent my first month back in Riverside meeting with contractors, architects, and city planning officials, trying to decide whether to restore the house as my home or convert it into the foundation's headquarters. The solution came from an unexpected source. Tommy, Michael's 9-year-old son, had been fascinated by my work since the day we'd reconciled as a family. During a Sunday dinner at Mom's house, he asked me to explain what social workers do. "We help families stay together when they're having problems," I told him. "Sometimes children can't live with their parents for a while, so we find safe places for them to stay. Then we work with everyone involved to solve the problems so families can be reunited." "Like foster families?" he asked. "Exactly like foster families." Tommy thought about this for a moment, then asked, "But where do the kids go when they need to visit their parents or meet with their social workers? Do they have to go to scary office buildings like in movies?" His question sparked an idea that would transform both the house renovation and the foundation's mission. What if Grandpa's house became a family visitation center, a place where children in foster care could spend time with their biological parents in a comfortable, home-like environment? What if the foundation provided not just traditional social work services, but also a physical space designed to support family relationships during the reunification process? I presented the idea to Mom and Michael during our next family meeting, spreading architectural drawings across Mom's dining room table and explaining my vision for converting the Elm Street house into a comprehensive family resource center. The first floor would include offices for foundation staff, meeting rooms for family conferences, and a large kitchen where families could prepare meals together during supervised visits. The second floor would have playrooms for children, quiet, spaces for counseling sessions, and a library of resources for parents working toward reunification with their children. "It's ambitious," Michael said, studying the plans, "but it's also brilliant. You'd be creating something that doesn't exist anywhere else in our county, something that could serve as a model for other communities." Mom was quiet for several minutes, walking around the table to examine the drawings from different angles. Finally, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Your father would have loved this," she said. "He always believed that the best business ideas came from identifying needs that weren't being met. This house has been empty for 8 years, waiting for the right purpose. I think you found it." The renovation took 4 months and cost most of my savings, but the result exceeded my wildest expectations. Working with local contractors and craftsmen, we restored the house's original charm while adding modern conveniences and accessibility features. The first floor maintained the Victorian elegance of carved woodwork and stained glass windows, while incorporating comfortable furniture, state-of-the-art technology, and a fully equipped kitchen designed for family meal preparation. The second floor was transformed into spaces specifically designed for children's needs. The largest room became a playroom with toys, games, and art supplies appropriate for various age groups. A smaller room was set up as a quiet retreat with soft lighting, comfortable seating, and a collection of books for children who needed space to process difficult emotions. The third room became a teen lounge with computers, gaming systems, and study areas for older children working on homework during family visits. Throughout the renovation process, word spread around Riverside about my return and the foundation I was establishing. The response from the community was overwhelmingly positive. Local businesses offered discounts on supplies and services. The Riverside Community Foundation provided a grant to help fund the first year's operating expenses. 3 experienced social workers from neighboring counties applied for positions with the new organization, excited about the opportunity to work in a family-centered environment. The most meaningful support came from unexpected sources. Pastor Williams from St. Mary's Church, where Dad's funeral had been held, offered to provide chaplain services for families dealing with crisis situations. The Riverside School District agreed to partner with the foundation to provide educational support for children in foster care. Even the police department expressed interest in collaborating on cases involving family crisis intervention. But the moment that truly felt like homecoming happened on a Tuesday evening in October, 3 weeks before the foundation was scheduled to open officially. I was at the Elm Street house, working late to finish organizing files in my new office, when I heard a knock at the front door. Mom stood on the porch holding a casserole dish and wearing the kind of smile I remembered from my childhood, when she'd surprise me with special dinners or unexpected treats. "I thought you might be working too late to make yourself a proper meal," she said, stepping into the foyer and looking around at the finished renovation. "This place is absolutely beautiful, Emma. It feels like a real home, even though it's an office." We sat in the kitchen eating her famous tuna noodle casserole, the same dish she'd made for my birthday dinners when I was 8 years old. The familiar taste brought back memories of family celebrations, holiday traditions, and the sense of belonging I'd missed during my years in Cleveland. "Mom," I said as we finished eating, "I want you to know how grateful I am for the way you've welcomed me back. I know it wasn't easy to accept my career choice, and I know it took courage to admit that Dad had kept secrets about our relationship." She reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Sweetheart, I want you to know something important. Your father wasn't the only one who was proud of your work. I've been learning about social work, reading articles about child welfare, trying to understand the field you've dedicated your life to. What you do matters in ways I never appreciated before. Thank you for taking the time to learn about it," I said. "That means more to me than you know. But I also want to tell you something else," she continued. "I'm proud of you not just for your professional accomplishments, but for the woman you've become. You left home following your heart, even when it was difficult. You built a successful career in a challenging field. You maintained your integrity and your compassion, even when your family didn't support your choices. And now you've found a way to come home without compromising your values or your mission." Those words felt like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for 6 years. I'd found my calling, reconciled with my family, and created a way to honor both Dad's memory and my own passion for helping children and families. The Sullivan Family Foundation for Children's Services officially opened its doors on November 15th, exactly 8 months after Dad's funeral. Our first client was a young mother named Sarah, whose 3 children had been placed in foster care while she completed a drug treatment program. Sarah was clean, employed, and working with a county social worker toward reunification, but she hadn't been able to spend quality time with her children in a home-like environment for 6 months. Watching Sarah prepare lunch for her kids in our kitchen, seeing her youngest daughter help set the table while her son showed her his school artwork, witnessing the family rebuild their connection in a space designed for healing. I knew Dad would have been proud of what his final gift had made possible. The foundation grew quickly. Within 6 months, we were serving 40 families and had a waiting list for our visitation programs. The State Department of Children's Services began referring cases from surrounding counties, recognizing the unique value of our family-centered approach. Local universities started sending social work students for internships, eager to learn about innovative practices in family preservation. But the most rewarding aspect of the work was deeply personal. Every day brought opportunities to use the skills I'd developed in Cleveland while serving the community where I'd grown up. I saw former classmates who were now foster parents, worked with families from neighborhoods I'd walked through as a child, and collaborated with professionals who remembered me as Robert Sullivan's youngest daughter. The integration of my professional identity with my family identity felt seamless in ways I'd never expected. Mom started volunteering at the foundation one afternoon a week, helping families prepare meals during visitation and offering the kind of maternal warmth that some parents needed to see modeled. Michael provided accounting services pro bono, ensuring that the foundation's finances were managed with the same precision Dad had brought to his business. Even Tommy became part of the foundation's extended family. He started spending afternoons at the center after school, helping younger children with homework and teaching them games during family visits. His natural compassion and easy way with kids made him a favorite among our client families, and watching him interact with children who'd experienced trauma reminded me why I'd chosen social work in the first place. 1 year after Dad's funeral, on a cold March afternoon that reminded me of the day we'd gathered in Mr. Harrison's office, I stood in the front yard of the Elm Street house watching families arrive for our afternoon programming. A father who'd been working toward reunification for 8 months was finally taking his twin daughters home permanently. A grandmother who'd become a kinship caregiver for her grandson was bringing him to spend time with his mother, who was nearing completion of her treatment program. A teenage girl who'd aged out of foster care was attending our independent living skills group, learning to manage finances and apply for college. Each of these families represented success in different forms. Some were reuniting after periods of separation. Others were creating new configurations that prioritized children's safety while maintaining family connections. All of them were proof that love, with the right support and resources, could overcome tremendous obstacles. As I watched these families enter the house that had become a symbol of hope and healing, I thought about Dad's letter and his final request that we become whole again as a family. We had accomplished that goal, but we'd also become something more. We'd become a family that used our resources, our talents, and our love to help other families find their way back to each other. The phone in my pocket buzzed with a text message from Mom. Sunday dinner at 5. Michael is bringing dessert, and Tommy wants to show you his science project. Love you. I smiled, pocketing the phone and walking toward the house where children's laughter was spilling out through open windows. This was home. Not just the place where I'd been born and raised, but the place where my heart, my work, and my family had finally come together in exactly the way they were meant to. Dad had been right about so many things in his final letter. Love did require courage, honesty, and the willingness to admit when we were wrong. Family relationships were precious and fragile, requiring consistent effort and mutual forgiveness. And sometimes, the most beautiful endings came from the most painful beginnings. Walking up the front steps of Grandpa's house, now transformed into a place where broken families could begin to heal, I realized that Dad's greatest gift hadn't been the money or the property. It had been the truth, delivered at exactly the moment when we were finally ready to hear it, use it, and let it change us for the better. Some stories end with dramatic revelations or perfect resolutions. This story ended with something simpler and more profound. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that love, given enough time and courage, can transform not just individuals, but entire communities. Dad would have been proud of what we'd built together, and that pride would have been based not on our success, but on our willingness to use that success in service of something greater than ourselves. 3 years after Dad's funeral, I found myself standing in the exact same spot where my journey had begun, outside St. Mary's Catholic Church in Riverside, Ohio. But this time, I wasn't clutching a funeral program with trembling hands or wondering if my own family would accept me. This time, I was wearing my best navy dress and holding a speech I'd written for the dedication ceremony of the new children's wing being added to our community hospital. The plaque beside the entrance would read, "The Robert Sullivan Family Services Wing, dedicated to healing families and honoring love that transcends understanding." The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to speak at the same church where I'd been turned away from my father's funeral. But Pastor Williams had specifically requested that the dedication ceremony be held here, in the sanctuary where our community gathered for its most important celebrations and farewells. "This is where your father's story ended," he'd told me, when we planned the event. It seems fitting that it's also where his legacy gets celebrated and continued. The past 3 years had transformed not just my family, but our entire community's approach to child welfare and family services. The Sullivan Family Foundation had grown from a small operation serving 40 families to a regional resource center that worked with over 300 families annually. We'd expanded our staff to 12 full-time employees, opened satellite offices in 2 neighboring counties, and developed programs that were being replicated in communities across Ohio. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real measure of our success lived in the faces of children who'd been reunited with parents, in the stability of families who'd learned new ways to communicate and solve problems, in the network of foster families and kinship caregivers who'd received training and support through our programs. Every success story was a testament to Dad's final act of love, his decision to use his death as a catalyst for healing rather than allowing our family's pain to continue indefinitely. The hospital's decision to name their new children's wing, after Dad had come as a surprise. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the hospital's chief administrator, had approached me 6 months earlier with a proposal that took my breath away. The hospital board had been following the foundation's work and had decided that their new pediatric mental health facility should honor the man whose legacy had transformed how their community supported families in crisis. "Your father's story has become legendary around here," Dr. Martinez had explained during our initial meeting, not just because of his successful business or his community involvement, but because of how he used his death to heal a fractured family and create something beautiful from pain. The new wing will provide mental health services specifically for children who've experienced trauma, and we want it to reflect the same philosophy your foundation embodies, that families can heal when they're given the right support and resources. The new wing would house individual and family therapy offices, group counseling rooms, play therapy spaces, and a specialized unit for children requiring short-term inpatient mental health care. More importantly, it would operate on the same family-centered principles that guided our foundation's work. Parents would be involved in their children's treatment planning, siblings would be included in therapy sessions when appropriate, and the entire facility would be designed to feel more like a welcoming home than a sterile medical environment. Standing outside the church, I could see the cars arriving for the dedication ceremony. Mom's silver sedan, polished to perfection for the occasion. Michael's SUV, with Jessica and Tommy visible through the windows. Aunt Carol's ancient Buick, which she refused to replace despite offers from various family members to help her buy something newer. Mr. Harrison's Mercedes, because he'd insisted on attending even though he was officially retired. But there were also cars I wouldn't have expected 3 years ago. Marcus had driven down from Cleveland with his sisters, all 3 of them now thriving young adults who credited their success to the intervention they'd received during their time in foster care. Several former clients of the foundation had requested permission to attend, wanting to honor the man whose posthumous generosity had helped their families rebuild. Social workers from across the region had come to celebrate a legacy that had inspired innovations in their own communities. As I walked toward the church entrance, I was intercepted by Sarah Chen, the young mother who'd been our foundation's first client 4 years earlier. Sarah had successfully reunited with her 3 children and had since become one of our most dedicated volunteer coordinators, helping other parents navigate the complex process of family reunification. "Miss Emma," she said, approaching with her oldest daughter Emily in tow. Emily was now 8 years old, confident and happy, showing no obvious signs of the trauma she'd experienced during her early years in foster care. "I wanted to make sure I got to speak with you before the ceremony started. Emily has something she wanted to give you." Emily stepped forward shyly, holding a folded piece of construction paper decorated with crayon drawings of houses, flowers, and stick figures that were clearly meant to represent families. "I made this for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a picture of all the families that got better because of your house." I knelt down to Emily's eye level, accepting the drawing with the solemnity it deserved. The houses were drawn in bright colors, each one surrounded by smiling stick figures holding hands. In the center of the page, Emily had written in careful second-grade handwriting, "Thank you for helping families love each other." "This is beautiful, Emily," I told her, fighting back tears. "I'm going to frame it and put it in my office so I can look at it every day and remember why our work matters." Emily beamed, then surprised me by throwing her arms around my neck in an enthusiastic hug. "My mom says you saved our family," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on us." As Emily and Sarah headed into the church, I remained outside for a few more minutes, needing a moment to compose myself before facing the crowd that had gathered to celebrate Dad's legacy. The drawing Emily had given me was folded carefully, in my purse, but her words echoed in my mind. "Thank you for not giving up on us." That phrase captured something essential about the work we did at the foundation, something that went beyond the technical skills of social work or the administrative complexities of running a nonprofit organization. At its core, our work was about refusing to give up on people, about believing that families could heal and change and grow even when they'd experienced terrible trauma or made devastating mistakes. It was a philosophy that Dad had lived by in his own way, even when I couldn't see it. He'd never given up on me, even when I chose a career path he didn't understand. He'd never stopped loving me, even when pride and stubbornness kept us from communicating openly. His weekly phone calls had been his way of refusing to give up on our relationship, just as his final letter had been his way of refusing to let death end his ability to heal our family. Inside the church, the sanctuary was fuller than I'd expected. Pastor Williams had estimated that maybe 50 people would attend the dedication ceremony, but I counted at least twice that number as I made my way to the front pew where Mom and Michael were saving a seat for me. The crowd included not just family and foundation supporters, but also community leaders, hospital staff, local business owners, and families who'd been touched by our work over the past 3 years. Dr. Martinez opened the ceremony with remarks about the hospital's commitment to children's mental health and the innovative approaches the new wing would incorporate. She spoke about Dad's legacy with a warmth that suggested she'd truly understood the significance of his final acts, not just as a generous donation, but as a model for how individuals could create positive change even in their darkest moments. "Robert Sullivan understood something that many of us struggle to grasp," she said, addressing the gathered crowd. "He understood that our greatest failures can become the foundation for our most meaningful successes, if we're willing to be honest about our mistakes and brave enough to use them as opportunities for growth and healing." When she introduced me to speak about the foundation's work and its connection to Dad's memory, I walked to the podium carrying Emily's drawing along with my prepared remarks. Looking out at the faces in the congregation, I saw representatives of every aspect of my life: family members who'd supported my journey home, colleagues who'd helped build the foundation, clients who'd trusted us with their most precious relationships, and community members who'd embraced our mission. 3 years ago, I began. I stood outside this church believing that my family had rejected me and that my father had died disappointed in the choices I'd made. I was wrong about almost everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the ways that people show they care about each other. I told the assembled group about Dad's secret phone calls, about his hidden pride in my career, about the sacrifice he'd made in allowing Mom and Michael to believe I'd abandoned him rather than revealing the truth about our ongoing relationship. I explained how his final letter had given our family not just financial resources, but the honesty and courage we needed to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by pride and miscommunication. The foundation exists because my father understood something crucial about healing, I continued. He understood that sometimes love requires sacrifice, that sometimes healing requires truth, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the freedom to become who they're meant to be, even when it's not who we planned for them to be. I shared statistics about the families we'd served, the children who'd been reunited with parents, the kinship caregivers who'd received training and support, but I also shared stories about individual families like Sarah and Emily, about teenagers who'd aged out of foster care and found mentorship through our programs, about grandparents who'd stepped up to raise grandchildren when parents couldn't, provide safe homes. Each of these success stories represents the ripple effects of one man's decision to use his death as a catalyst for healing, rather than allowing pain to perpetuate itself, I said. My father's legacy lives not in buildings or bank accounts, but in the families who've learned to love each other better because of the resources his generosity made possible. When I finished speaking, the applause was warm and sustained. But what moved me most was the sight of Mom wiping tears from her eyes with obvious pride. Michael was applauding enthusiastically, and Tommy was grinning at me from his seat beside Jessica. This was my family, whole and healed and genuinely supportive of the work that had once seemed like a rejection of everything they valued. After the ceremony, people lingered in the church fellowship hall, sharing memories of Dad and discussing the foundation's work over coffee and homemade cookies provided by the church's hospitality committee. I found myself in conversations with hospital social workers interested in collaborating on discharge planning for children with mental health needs, with county officials exploring ways to expand our programming to underserved rural areas, and with graduate students considering careers in child welfare. But the conversation that meant the most to me happened near the end of the reception, when Marcus approached me carrying a manila folder filled with what appeared to be college transcripts and official documents. "Miss Emma," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of a young man who'd overcome significant challenges and found his purpose. "I wanted to tell you something important. I'm graduating from Case Western in May with my Master of Social Work degree." I'd known Marcus was in graduate school, but hearing him say the words filled me with a pride that felt both personal and professional. This young man, who'd been separated from his sisters and bouncing between foster homes when I first met him, was about to become a social worker himself. "That's wonderful, Marcus," I said. "I'm so proud of you. What kind of work are you planning to do after graduation?" He grinned, opening the folder to show me an official letter on Sullivan Family Foundation letterhead. "Actually, I'm hoping to work here. I applied for the position you posted for a family reunification specialist, and I got an interview next week." I stared at the letter, recognizing it as one I'd written myself just 2 weeks earlier. In all the applications we'd received for the position, I hadn't noticed Marcus's name, probably because he'd used his full legal name rather than the nickname I'd always known him by. "Marcus Johnson," I said, reading the name on his application. "I should have realized. Of course you want to come work here." "I want to help families the way you helped mine," he said simply. "I want kids like me to know that someone believes in them, that someone is willing to fight for them to stay connected to the people they love. I learned that from watching you work with my family, and I've been preparing for this opportunity ever since." The idea of Marcus joining our foundation staff felt like the perfect circle, a completion of something that had begun years earlier when I'd first decided to pursue social work. He would bring not just professional training and personal experience, but also a deep understanding of what our work meant to the families we served. "The interview is just a formality," I told him. "If you want the job, it's yours. We'd be honored to have you on our team." As the reception wound down and people began heading home, I stood with Mom and Michael in the church parking lot, watching cars pull away and reflecting on how different this gathering had been from the last time our family had been at St. Mary's together. "Dad would have loved this," Michael said, echoing thoughts I'd been having all afternoon. Not just the recognition or the dedication ceremony, but seeing how his story has inspired other people to think differently about family, forgiveness, and second chances. Mom nodded, pulling her cardigan closer around her shoulders as the October evening grew cooler. He always believed that every ending was really a beginning in disguise. I think he'd say that his death was really the beginning of something more beautiful than anything he could have created while he was alive. It was, I agreed. But I think he'd also say that the real legacy isn't the foundation or the hospital wing or any of the external things we've built. The real legacy is that we learned to love each other honestly, without conditions or expectations, or hidden agendas. As we stood there together, I thought about the letter Dad had written 3 years earlier, the letter that had changed everything we thought we knew about our family relationships. He'd asked for forgiveness for the secrets he'd kept, the pain he'd caused, and the time we'd lost to misunderstanding and pride. But looking back now, I realized that his secrets and his pride had been expressions of love. Just love that was complicated by his own fears and limitations. The weekly phone calls he'd maintained with me while allowing Mom and Michael to believe I'd abandoned the family weren't perfect solutions to our problems, but they were acts of love performed by a man who was trying to protect everyone he cared about, even when those efforts created new complications. His final letter wasn't just a confession or an apology. It was a roadmap for how love could overcome the mistakes that love sometimes creates. 6 months after the dedication ceremony, I received a phone call that brought everything full circle, in a way I never could have anticipated. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was in my office at the foundation reviewing case files when my assistant knocked on my door. "Emma, there's someone here to see you," she said. "She says it's about your father and something called the Sunday phone calls." The woman waiting in our reception area was probably in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that looked familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. She introduced herself as Dorothy Chen, and when she said her name, I realized why. She looked familiar. She had the same eyes as Sarah Chen, the young mother who'd been our first client. "I'm Sarah's grandmother," she explained, settling into the chair across from my desk. "But I'm also here because of something that happened 3 years ago. Something I've been wanting to tell you about ever since." Dorothy opened her purse and pulled out a small notebook, the kind elderly people often carry to jot down important phone numbers or grocery lists. "Your father and I met at the hospital during his last week," she began. "I was there visiting Sarah's youngest daughter, who was having some complications after a surgery. Your father was there for tests related to his heart condition." She opened the notebook to a page filled with handwriting I immediately recognized as Dad's careful script. We got to talking in the waiting room, and somehow the conversation turned to children and family relationships. When I mentioned that my granddaughter was working with a social worker to get her children back, your father became very interested. Dorothy smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. He told me about his daughter who was a social worker in Cleveland, about how proud he was of her work, even though he'd never been able to tell her that directly. He said he'd been calling her every Sunday for years, but that the rest of his family didn't know about the calls, because he'd made some mistakes early on that he didn't know how to fix. I leaned forward, fascinated by this glimpse into Dad's final days. "What did he say about the mistakes?" "He said he'd reacted poorly when you first told him about wanting to become a social worker, that he'd let his own fears about your future make him say things he didn't mean." He was ashamed of how he'd handled the situation, and he was afraid that if he told your mother and brother about your phone calls, they'd pressure you to come home before you were ready. Dorothy turned to another page in her notebook where she'd apparently written down some of Dad's exact words. He said, "I love Emma too much to interfere with her success, but I also love her too much to let her think I don't support her choices. So I call her every Sunday, and I let my wife and son believe I'm heartbroken by her absence, because it's easier for me to carry their disappointment than for Emma to carry the burden of family expectations." The revelation was stunning. Even in his final week, when he must have known his health was declining, Dad had been thinking about how to protect me from family pressure while maintaining our secret connection. He'd been carrying the weight of Mom and Michael's disappointment, not because he didn't know how to tell them the truth, but because he believed the truth would create new problems for me. "There's more," Dorothy continued, turning to the last page of notes in her notebook. "Your father asked me to write down my contact information because he wanted to do something for Sarah's family. He said that if his daughter was helping children and families in Cleveland, he wanted to make sure children and families in his own community had access to the same kind of support." She handed me a business card that showed Dorothy was a retired teacher who'd spent 40 years working in Riverside's elementary schools. "Your father contacted me the week before he died and asked if I'd be willing to help establish some kind of family support program in Riverside. He said he had resources he wanted to dedicate to helping local families, and he thought my experience with children and knowledge of the community would be valuable." The implications of what Dorothy was telling me were overwhelming. Dad hadn't just been planning to leave money for my work. He'd been actively researching how to create family support services in Riverside even before he died. The foundation I'd established with his trust fund hadn't just been made possible by his generosity. It had been the fulfillment of a vision he'd been developing during his final weeks. "Did he give you any specific ideas about what this program should look like?" I asked. Dorothy smiled, pulling one more document from her purse. It was a legal pad covered with Dad's handwriting, outlining ideas for family visitation programs, kinship care support, foster family training, and community partnerships with schools and healthcare providers. At the top of the page, he'd written, "Emma's Foundation," and underlined it twice. Reading his notes was like discovering a conversation we'd never had, a collaboration that had existed only in his imagination. But every idea he'd written down had become reality through the Foundation's programs. The Family Visitation Center he'd envisioned was the core of our work. The kinship care support he'd outlined was one of our most successful programs. The community partnerships he'd suggested were the relationships that had made our expansion possible. "Mrs. Chen," I said, looking up from Dad's notes, "would you be interested in joining our Foundation's board of directors? We could use someone with your educational background and community connections, and I think Dad would have loved knowing that his original vision was being guided by someone who understood his intentions." She agreed immediately, and over the following months, Dorothy became one of our most valuable advisors. Her insights into child development and her relationships with local families helped us refine our programs and expand our reach. More importantly, her stories about Dad's final week helped me understand that his love for me had been even more profound and forward-thinking than his letter had revealed. As I write this story, 5 years after Dad's funeral, the Sullivan family Foundation continues to grow and evolve. We've served over 600 families, helped reunite more than 200 children with their parents, and provided support to countless kinship caregivers and foster families. The hospital's Robert Sullivan Family Services Wing has become a model for pediatric mental health care, incorporating family-centered principles that are being replicated in medical facilities across the Midwest. But the numbers, impressive as they are, still only tell part of the story. The real measure of Dad's legacy lives in the individual lives that have been transformed by the resources his final gift made possible. It lives in Marcus, who graduated from social work school and now leads our teen services program. It lives in Sarah and Emily, who volunteer at the foundation and share their story with other families facing similar challenges. It lives in the dozens of other families who've discovered that love, with the right support, can overcome almost any obstacle. It also lives in my own family, which has become stronger and more honest than it ever was before Dad's death forced us to confront our assumptions about each other. Mom and I have coffee every Tuesday morning, not because we feel obligated to maintain contact, but because we genuinely enjoy each other's company and have learned to appreciate our different perspectives on life. Michael and I collaborate regularly on foundation business, but we also talk about books, movies, and the challenges of balancing work with family responsibilities. Tommy, now 12 years old, has grown up watching the foundation's work and has already announced his intention to become either a social worker or a family therapist when he grows up. He volunteers at the center on weekends, helping younger children with homework and teaching them games during family visits. His natural empathy and leadership skills suggest he'll be successful in whatever helping profession he ultimately chooses. Most importantly, we've learned to love each other without conditions, without hidden agendas, and without the fear that honesty will damage our relationships. We've learned that families, like individuals, can heal and grow and become better versions of themselves when they're willing to face difficult truths with courage and compassion. Dad's story began with a man who loved his daughter so much that he couldn't bear to see her make choices he didn't understand. It continued with 3 years of secret phone calls that maintained their connection while protecting her from family pressure. It culminated with a letter that used truth as a tool for healing and forgiveness. But the story doesn't end with Dad's death, or even with our family's reconciliation. It continues in every family we serve at the foundation, in every child who's reunited with parents who've learned to provide safe and loving homes, in every kinship caregiver who receives the support they need to raise grandchildren or nieces, or nephews, in every foster family that opens their hearts to children who need temporary or permanent homes. Dad's legacy lives on not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to use his imperfections as opportunities for growth and healing. He transformed his own mistakes into resources for helping other families avoid similar pain. He used his death as a catalyst for creating something beautiful and lasting that continues to grow and evolve years after he's gone. Standing in the eye. Foundation's main office this morning, looking at Emily's drawing still hanging in its frame beside my desk, I'm struck by the truth she captured in her 8-year-old wisdom. Families can love each other better when they have the right support and resources. Dad understood that truth in his final weeks, and he spent his last days creating the resources that would help our family and countless other families learn to love each other more honestly and completely. That's his real legacy, not the money, or the buildings or the programs, but the understanding that love requires courage, that healing requires truth, and that the most beautiful endings often grow from the most painful beginnings. It's a legacy that will continue as long as there are families who need support, children who need advocates, and people who believe that love, with enough courage and support, can overcome almost anything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.